The bright lights of Hollywood had always been unforgiving, but today, they felt particularly hot. The press conference was in full swing, with a buzz of excitement filling the air as the stars of the latest blockbuster gathered for the premiere of Mission Impossible: Reckoning. Amidst the glitz and glamour, there was one figure who stood apart, a man who had been in the spotlight for decades and whose name was as recognizable as any on the planet: Tom Cruise. Tom had seen it all. The highs, the lows, the press attacks, and the fanfare. But despite the never-ending scrutiny, he had remained grounded. His energy was unmatched, and even at the age of 60, his commitment to his craft and his fans never wavered. His smile was as charismatic as ever, and his presence commanded attention without the need for words. However, at this particular event, there was one journalist who would not be intimidated by that presence. A self-proclaimed liberal reporter, David Klein, stood in the back of the room, his arms folded with an air of superiority. Known for his sharp opinions and biting commentary, Klein had built his career on challenging celebrities, especially those with the level of fame and influence that Tom commanded. Klein had always seen himself as an advocate for the truth, willing to tear down anyone he considered part of the establishment. And on this night, Tom Cruise was his target. Klein had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had been eager to confront Tom about his political views, his past relationships with certain controversial figures, and his unwavering commitment to the Church of Scientology. His eyes glinted with determination as he waited for his chance to strike. The journalist was known for his hard-hitting interviews and his ability to make even the most untouchable stars squirm under pressure. But tonight, he would face a man who was anything but intimidated by the spotlight. As the press conference began, Tom stood at the front, answering questions with his usual charm. The room filled with admiration, with flashes from cameras illuminating the darkened space. Yet, through it all, Klein's eyes never left Tom. He had a plan, and it was time to execute it. Finally, the moment came. Klein raised his hand, his voice cutting through the hum of the press. "Mr. Cruise," he began, his tone dripping with disdain, "you've been known to associate with controversial figures, politicians who promote division, actors who have been accused of unethical behavior. Do you feel any responsibility for the image you project, especially considering the platform you have? How do you justify your involvement in these circles?" The room went quiet. The cameras snapped, capturing the intense moment. Tom, who had been answering questions with ease just moments before, paused. There was a long silence. Everyone held their breath, waiting for him to react. Klein, confident in his delivery, leaned back slightly, expecting Tom to falter. After all, how could someone as polished and successful as Tom Cruise defend his public image in the face of such pointed accusations? This was the moment Klein had been waiting for. But what happened next shocked everyone in the room. Tom Cruise, who had always been known for his quiet strength and unshakable confidence, stood up straighter. He looked Klein directly in the eyes, and the smile on his face didn't fade, but something about it changed. It was calm, almost disarming. "David," Tom said, his voice steady, but there was a slight edge to it now. "I've been in this industry for over 40 years. I've faced more public scrutiny than most people will ever know. And through it all, I've learned one thing: what people say about you doesn't define who you are. It's your actions that speak for you." The room was still, everyone waiting for Klein's next move. But Tom wasn't done. He continued, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You stand there, judging me, but I'm here to tell you that no matter how much you criticize or how much you point fingers, you'll never understand the truth of who I am. The truth isn't what the media tells you. It's not what you read in the headlines or see on your screens. It's what you do when no one is watching. I don't need your approval, David. And I don't need to explain myself to anyone." Klein's smug expression faltered for just a second. The confidence he had walked into the room with began to waver. Tom had always been the type to speak with conviction, but this moment was different. The words weren't just an answer to a question. They were a lesson, a challenge to the very way Klein had been using his platform. And as Tom's words lingered in the air, it was clear that this was about to become more than just another celebrity interview. This was a confrontation, one that would change everything. The press room was silent for a moment, but Tom Cruise didn't break eye contact with David Klein. The tension was so thick that it almost seemed as if time had frozen, the faces of the reporters around them expectantly waiting for something more to happen. Tom's response hung in the air like an electric charge, but the silence was only broken by the faint shuffle of a camera lens being adjusted, a nervous cough from someone in the back, and the steady click of keyboards as journalists typed furiously, unsure whether they were witnessing an unraveling or a turning point. David Klein wasn't used to being ignored. It was an unspoken rule in his world that journalists, especially those with his stature, always had the upper hand in any exchange. They were the ones who wielded power, they controlled the narrative. He had always been quick-witted, quick to find a flaw, quick to expose the cracks in even the most well-crafted facades. Celebrities, no matter how untouchable, were always fair game. Yet, here he was, facing someone who didn't seem to care one bit about the perception of the press, and for a moment, Klein was thrown off balance. David's lips tightened, the muscles in his jaw clenched as his eyes darted quickly to the reporters around him, seeking confirmation, some kind of alliance. But no one spoke. They were all too mesmerized by the calm strength radiating from Tom. Klein wasn't sure what to do. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment going. He had thought he'd have Tom cornered, expecting a fumbled answer, an outburst, some sign of vulnerability he could pounce on. But all he saw was the same composed, almost serene figure in front of him. Tom's unwavering calm was almost unnerving. For years, Klein had built his career on attacking the stars, exposing their flaws, pointing out their hypocrisy, unmasking their imperfections. He had a knack for digging up secrets, and he didn't care if the people he targeted were beloved by millions. To him, it was all about the story. About winning. But now, he found himself questioning his own script. "Is that all you have to say?" Klein finally blurted, trying to regain control of the situation, though his voice faltered ever so slightly. His confidence was starting to crack under the weight of Tom's quiet strength. Tom gave a slight nod, as if he had expected more. His lips curled into a gentle smile, not mocking or dismissive, but almost empathetic. There was no sense of confrontation in his eyes, only calm resolve. "I don't have to explain my life, David," Tom continued, his voice low but resolute. "What you do in this room won't change who I am or what I stand for. People like you, people like me, we're not so different, you know. We both have platforms, we both have voices. But while you stand there accusing, I'm here, doing the work. I'll keep doing the work, and you can keep judging. That's how this game works." The words lingered in the air like smoke, and for a second, Klein could almost feel the weight of them pressing against him. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a defense. It was simply the truth, a truth that resonated deeply and made his own actions feel small. And for the first time in a long time, David Klein felt the uncomfortable sting of doubt. Who was he really doing this for? Was it for the audience? For himself? Or was it just a desperate attempt to keep climbing the ladder in a world where the sensationalized truth had become more valuable than the real one? As the moments stretched on, the other journalists in the room seemed to shrink back into their seats, some glancing at their notes nervously, others shifting uncomfortably. Tom's quiet power had overtaken the room, and Klein was no longer the one in control. The reporter's mind raced, trying to find another angle, another way to challenge the movie star. But every word he could think of felt hollow now, lacking the force it once had. He glanced at the cameras, feeling the weight of their lenses on him, amplifying his every movement, his every breath. Tom's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "I've been where you are, David. I've wanted to point fingers, too. And I still do, sometimes. But there's one thing I've learned: you can only fight for what you believe in if you have something worth fighting for." His words weren't just aimed at Klein, they seemed to encompass the room, the world beyond the press conference, maybe even the entire media landscape. A subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere, an invisible change that everyone in the room felt, though few could articulate it. This wasn't a typical celebrity interview. This wasn't a moment for applause or viral headlines. This was a test of character. The reporters, including Klein, were confronted with something they didn't expect, a figure who refused to be swayed, who didn't need validation from them or anyone else. Tom's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, he looked more like a mentor than a celebrity. A person who had seen the world, understood its flaws, and yet still managed to carry himself with grace. There was no arrogance in his posture, no desire to win or defeat. There was only a quiet invitation to reflect. David Klein opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, there was only a brief silence that felt more profound than any interview question he could have posed. The tension in the press room remained palpable, but now it was shifting. There was no denying the uneasy weight of the conversation that had just unfolded, and David Klein was beginning to feel the sting of his earlier bravado fading into something far more uncomfortable. Tom's words had knocked him off balance, and now, the reporter found himself questioning whether he had gone too far. Klein had always prided himself on his ability to take down even the most impenetrable figures, those celebrities who had mastered the art of controlling their image. He was used to being in charge of the narrative. His reputation was built on exposing the flaws of Hollywood's elite, pushing boundaries, and drawing blood from even the most polished stars. But this was different. Tom Cruise wasn't the man Klein had expected. Yes, he was still a Hollywood titan, an icon of unmatched fame, but he wasn't fragile. He wasn't the kind of man who could be intimidated into defending himself or resorting to sensationalism. Tom's calm, measured response had made Klein feel small in a way that he hadn't felt in years. And now, as he sat at the back of the room, watching the other journalists scribbling down their notes, a doubt was creeping into his mind. Had he underestimated Tom? Had he made a mistake? Klein could feel the eyes of the room on him, the other reporters, the camera operators, the PR team. They all seemed to recognize the shift. No longer was he the center of attention. His aggressive questioning, which had so often been the highlight of his career, had failed to land a single blow. He was no longer the sharp critic, he was the one exposed. His smugness felt hollow in the wake of Tom's self-assuredness. The uncomfortable silence stretched on, until finally, Klein cleared his throat, attempting to regain some of his previous confidence. "Mr. Cruise," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I respect your career, but I think it's fair to ask, how do you justify your association with certain political figures who are, let's say, less than universally admired? Don't you think it's irresponsible to stay so closely linked to people who represent division in this country? Don't you think the public has a right to know where you stand?" Tom didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed amused by the question. It was as if Klein's attacks no longer had any power. "David," Tom said, his voice still steady but now carrying a hint of warmth, "the world is full of division, but we can't solve anything by pointing fingers and casting blame. What we need is more understanding. More listening." His eyes scanned the room, his words cutting through the room like a soft wind. "As for my personal beliefs, I've spent decades living my life in the public eye. I don't hide behind a mask, but I also don't feel the need to answer every single question about my private life. We all have the right to our opinions and the right to make our own choices. My job is to make movies that inspire and challenge, not to conform to anyone's expectations." Klein felt the sting of Tom's response even deeper now. This wasn't just about exposing a flaw or cracking open a scandal. Tom was reminding him, and everyone in the room, that there was more to life than what appeared on the surface. That everyone, even those in the public eye, had the right to their personal space and beliefs. It wasn't the answer Klein was hoping for. He wanted something more vulnerable, something he could twist into a headline. But instead, Tom's words seemed to have the opposite effect. The room was quiet again. This time, it wasn't the silence of tension, it was the kind of stillness that follows a realization. Klein shifted in his seat, uneasy. He could feel the gaze of the other journalists on him now, their skepticism growing. Was this really the story they had come to hear? Was this going to be the headline of the day? The question began to gnaw at him, was he out of his depth here? The idea of humbling Tom Cruise felt less like a bold move and more like a pipe dream. He had failed to rattle the actor. Worse, he had lost the respect of the room. But just as Klein was about to concede to his inner turmoil, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his editor, a demand to get something substantial, something explosive, from the press conference. There was no room for soft answers or half-hearted stories. The pressure was mounting. Klein's career was on the line. This couldn't be a neutral exchange. This had to be the one that would keep his spot at the top. His fingers twitched at the phone, but he resisted the urge to check the message. He couldn't let his editor dictate his actions. He had to regain control. This wasn't just about Tom Cruise anymore. It was about David Klein, the reporter who had built a reputation on uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. A sudden idea flashed in Klein's mind, one that could turn the tide of the conversation back in his favor. He looked directly at Tom, a new edge to his voice. "You say that your beliefs are private, but do you think it's responsible for someone in your position to hide behind your privacy while the world around us crumbles? People look up to you, Tom. They look up to you for guidance, for leadership. Don't you think it's time to stop hiding and take a stand? Otherwise, what good is all the fame if you don't use it for something bigger?" Klein's words were sharp, calculated. The shot had been fired, and this time, there would be no hesitation. He was no longer going to let Tom get away with dodging the hard questions. Tom's face didn't change. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just that same, calm resolve. "David," he began, his tone quieter now, but somehow more intense, "I've spent my life giving people something to believe in, through my work, my actions. I've made films that have inspired millions. But you're asking me to use my platform to do what you think is right, not what I believe is right. That's the difference. I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their lives. I'm here to do my job." Klein's heart raced. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battle of ideologies. And, he realized, he had underestimated his opponent. Tom wasn't just a movie star, he was a force. And now, Klein found himself at a crossroads. Would he continue to push, risking everything? Or would he finally admit that, perhaps, Tom had a point? Just as the tension was about to break, Tom stood up. His eyes locked with Klein's one last time before he turned toward the exit. It was clear this conversation was over. But the sting of his words lingered. And so, the game began. Klein had pushed too far, but in the process, he discovered something far more dangerous than a Hollywood star's image. He had uncovered a truth about power, influence, and responsibility. The question was no longer about who would win the exchange. It was about what kind of man would David Klein choose to be. The days that followed the press conference were anything but quiet. David Klein found himself back in his office, surrounded by the familiar clutter of papers, notepads, and half-empty coffee cups. But this time, there was a noticeable tension in the air. His editor had already sent him a few messages demanding an update on the Cruise interview. The pressure to land something substantial was mounting, and each message felt like a dagger aimed directly at his professional pride. He could almost hear the unspoken expectations. "You don't get to sit on a story like this, Klein. You need results." Klein had always been a master of getting what he wanted out of interviews, but this time was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers, like sand from a clenched fist. Tom Cruise had turned the tables on him. Instead of being the villain of the story, he had been positioned as a man of principle, unshaken by the barrage of questions. Klein had gone in thinking he could bring down another titan. Instead, he was left grappling with his own sense of inadequacy. The feeling gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into his own insecurities. For the first time in a long while, Klein wasn't sure if he could win this battle. Sure, he still had his reputation to fall back on, but the emotional toll of the encounter with Tom was leaving its mark. How did he strike back at a man who didn't rise to the bait? Who refused to be swayed by public pressure? The more Klein thought about it, the more the frustration bubbled inside him. In the midst of this turmoil, an unexpected phone call arrived. It was his editor, again. "David," the voice on the other end crackled, "I'm not seeing anything from that Cruise interview yet. Are you telling me you've got nothing for me?" This is your moment, Klein. Don't let it slip away. Make it happen. Klein clenched his jaw. His editor's words hit him like a cold slap in the face. There was no room for hesitation. The expectations were clear, a compelling, dramatic angle, something that would shake the public and make headlines. Anything less would be seen as a failure. And if there was one thing Klein knew, it was that he couldn't afford to fail. Still, he couldn't ignore the creeping voice in the back of his mind. What if this isn't the story you think it is? What if you're the one who's wrong? The questions buzzed, but Klein pushed them aside. He needed a plan. He needed an angle. The only way out of this was to dig deeper, push harder, and expose something that the public would care about. And so, he started planning his next move, knowing that it wouldn't be easy. Meanwhile, across town, Tom Cruise was facing a different set of challenges. Despite the composed exterior he had presented during the interview, there was a palpable shift in the public's perception. The media landscape had begun to change its approach to Tom's image. The confident silence he had maintained during the press conference had sparked debates across news outlets, and his refusal to respond to Klein's questions left people divided. Some saw Tom as a role model, a man who knew the value of privacy, who resisted the pressure to conform to public opinion. They admired him for standing firm in his beliefs. Others, however, were starting to turn on him, criticizing him for being evasive and dismissive of real-world issues. Some called him out for hiding behind his fame, and the comments on social media were growing increasingly hostile. Tom sat in his home office late one evening, his fingers brushing across his phone as he read through the articles and posts. It was a reminder that fame, even with its advantages, could turn on you in an instant. His PR team had already called several times, offering advice on how to counter the backlash. We can release a statement, maybe clarify your stance on political issues, or hold another interview to speak directly to the public, they suggested. But Tom wasn't sure he wanted to follow that path. Every move felt like it was part of the game, and he had no interest in playing it on anyone else's terms. Still, the pressure was mounting. His team urged him to do more, and people close to him began to question whether he had made the right call by remaining so silent. The stakes were rising, and even Tom couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. His career had weathered storms before, but this felt different. The way Klein had framed the conversation, how he had pushed Tom into a corner with his questions, made it clear that something was shifting in the public narrative. And then, there was the matter of the film project. Tom had been in talks to produce a movie that aimed to raise awareness about environmental issues. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The film, which he had poured so much energy into, was now threatened by the very same media cycle that had once cheered his every move. The idea that he might be seen as out of touch, a celebrity too removed from reality to understand the struggles of everyday people, was a concept that hit him harder than he'd care to admit. The public's expectations were unpredictable. The divide between his admirers and critics was growing, and Tom was realizing that the spotlight could turn ugly when you refused to give people the answers they wanted. But he wasn't sure what the right answers were anymore. That night, as Tom sat back in his chair, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the conflicting pressures bearing down on him. He wasn't just a movie star anymore. He was a symbol of something greater, a polarizing figure who could either stand as a beacon of self-respect or be seen as someone out of touch. But the truth was, Tom had always lived in the tension between those two worlds. His life had been a balancing act between being a public figure and maintaining his sense of self. The tension between him and Klein was about more than just a battle of egos. It was about the greater clash between personal integrity and public expectation, between truth and the sensationalism of the media. And in the coming days, both men would be forced to confront the consequences of their choices. But little did they know, the real stakes were yet to be revealed. What had started as an interview was beginning to take on a much more complex shape. Tom Cruise and David Klein were no longer just facing each other in the spotlight, they were caught in a much larger battle, one that had the potential to change not only their lives but the media landscape as a whole. The tension had been mounting for weeks. Tom Cruise's name had become the focal point of every conversation, his every move scrutinized by the media. But there was something in the air now, something that felt different, more volatile. The calm before the storm, perhaps. And for David Klein, the storm was about to hit harder than he ever expected. Klein's strategy had shifted. What began as a simple pursuit of a high-profile interview had now morphed into an all-out war of perceptions. He was no longer just reporting on Tom Cruise, he had become personally invested in unmasking him, in exposing the cracks in the facade that Tom had carefully constructed over the years. Every article, every headline that Klein published seemed to intensify the scrutiny surrounding Tom. With each passing day, the public's divided opinions became more extreme. Tom was either seen as a beacon of integrity or a pretentious, evasive celebrity with something to hide. But Klein was done with trying to provoke Tom through passive questions. It wasn't enough. He needed something bigger. He needed a statement that would reverberate through the media, something to cut through the noise and demand attention. It was time to go on the offensive. His plan was simple, yet risky. He would get Tom on camera again, but this time, he would have the tables turned. The interview would be framed in a way that made Tom the one answering for his silence, his refusal to play the media game. It would be confrontational, direct, and designed to force Tom into a corner. Klein had already set the stage, and the interview was scheduled for the following week. This time, there would be no playing nice. No calm, composed Tom Cruise. Klein would make sure of that. But as the interview drew nearer, Klein began to feel an unease he hadn't anticipated. The lines between professionalism and personal vendetta were beginning to blur. He started to question whether his pursuit of the story had morphed into something more sinister, a desire for vengeance, not truth. Meanwhile, Tom was preparing for what he knew would be another uncomfortable encounter with Klein. The words from his PR team echoed in his mind, urging him to take control of the narrative. But Tom, in his quiet defiance, had no intention of giving the media what it wanted. He would face Klein again, but this time, he was determined to remain true to himself, no matter what the outcome. The world could think what it wanted about him. Tom had learned long ago that he couldn't control how others saw him, but he could control how he responded. Tom was sitting in his trailer on the set of his latest film when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his assistant. "The interview is coming up. Are you sure you want to go ahead with it?" Tom paused, his finger hovering over the screen. His mind raced, but his response was immediate and certain: "Yes. Let's do it." He knew this wasn't just about clearing his name or proving a point. This was bigger than that. This was about maintaining his integrity in a world where everything and everyone seemed to have an agenda. The day of the interview arrived, and Klein was ready. He was determined to crack Tom. This time, he would be the one holding the power. The location was set, a neutral, upscale studio where the cameras would be rolling as they faced off once more. But Klein, despite his best efforts to hide it, was feeling the weight of what this meant. This wasn't just about a story anymore, it was personal. As Tom walked into the studio, dressed in a simple black shirt and jeans, he exuded an air of calm, his presence commanding without needing to shout. The room seemed quiet as he took his seat. Klein, on the other hand, was more visibly tense. His brow furrowed, his fingers tapping nervously against the table as he prepared to begin. His mind was racing, but he kept his eyes trained on Tom, trying to anticipate the direction the conversation would go. "Tom," Klein began, his voice steady but laced with underlying challenge, "you've stayed quiet for a long time now. People are starting to wonder why. What are you hiding?" The question landed with the precision of a bullet. It was blunt, accusatory. But Tom didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I'm not hiding anything, David," Tom replied, his tone unwavering, measured. "What's in the past is in the past. I've always said that I want to be known for my work, not the noise around it. If that's a crime, then so be it." Klein leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "But people want to know who you really are, Tom. They want to see past the movies and the image. They want the truth, not just the facade." The challenge was in the air now, thick with the promise of confrontation. Klein could feel it, his fingers twitching as he waited for Tom to break, to give him something, anything to use. But Tom, again, remained calm. "You can't dictate what people want, David," Tom replied. "Everyone has their own truth. My job isn't to meet everyone's expectations. It's to stay true to myself." There was a long pause as Klein processed the answer. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. Tom's defiance was both a strength and a weakness. If he could just break through that calm exterior, he could get to the heart of the story. But every question he asked, every jab he made, seemed to only reinforce Tom's control over the situation. Frustration began to build inside Klein. He wasn't used to being on the losing side. He was the one who shaped the narrative, not the other way around. And in that moment, something snapped. Klein leaned in closer, his voice dropping lower, more venomous. "You're nothing but a self-serving actor, Tom. You want to maintain this image while the rest of the world struggles. You think you're above it all, don't you?" The words hit Tom like a slap. But instead of reacting in anger, his eyes grew cold. He met Klein's gaze, unwavering. "No, David," Tom said, his voice still calm but now carrying a weight of finality. "I'm not above anyone. But I'm not going to let you dictate who I am, either. I'm not going to play your game. You want a story? Here it is. You've been so focused on tearing me down, you've forgotten to ask yourself why." The tension in the room was palpable. Klein could feel the weight of Tom's words sinking in. It was no longer just about a battle of wits. It was about something deeper, something that Klein couldn't quite grasp. This wasn't the end of the fight. But it was the beginning of something bigger, something that would change everything for both men. The tension in the studio was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Klein's mind was racing, but Tom's words had struck a deeper chord than he'd anticipated. His usual barrage of jabs and accusations no longer seemed to hold the weight they once did. Tom's calm demeanor and quiet confidence had cracked through his armor, forcing Klein to confront something that he hadn't considered before. For the first time in the interview, Klein found himself speechless. He had expected Tom to react with anger, to crumble under the weight of his aggressive questioning. Instead, he had been met with a profound stillness, a refusal to engage in the petty game Klein had set up. Tom had flipped the script, shifting the power dynamic in the room. And Klein was left grasping for control. Tom, sensing the shift in energy, leaned back in his chair. His expression was resolute, but there was a glimmer of something almost compassionate behind his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. But he wasn't going to let Klein continue down this path either. "You're right," Tom said, breaking the silence. "I've worked hard to build a career, a life, based on the things I believe in. And it's easy for people like you to tear that down. But that's not going to stop me. And it's not going to stop the people who truly care about what I do." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that caused Klein to falter. For all his arrogance, for all his attempts to break Tom down, he had underestimated the depth of the man sitting across from him. The realization hit Klein like a thunderclap. This wasn't about Tom trying to hide from the world, it was about Tom refusing to let someone else define his worth. Klein opened his mouth to retort, but the words didn't come. Something about Tom's sincerity had disarmed him. The very persona he had tried to tear apart seemed stronger, more grounded than ever before. "I spent my life building this image, but it's not for the reasons you think," Tom continued, his voice softening. "It's not about fame. It's not about adoration. It's about making a difference. I've met people who struggle every single day to keep going. And if they can do it, so can I. But that means taking the hits, staying humble, and not letting people like you steer my life." Klein's gaze flickered toward the camera, then back to Tom. His world, once black and white, was now shifting in ways he couldn't control. He had gone into this interview seeking a story, an angle that would elevate him, but now, he was realizing something crucial. His own pursuit of the truth had been tainted by a hunger for recognition, not honesty. Tom stood up slowly, his presence calm but unwavering. "I'll tell you something, David," he said, his voice carrying an authority that commanded the room. "It's easy to criticize someone from the outside. But you have no idea what it's like to walk in their shoes. Maybe it's time you learn that." With that, he turned to walk off set, leaving Klein alone at the table, his mind spinning. The interview had not gone as planned. It was no longer about the power dynamic between them. In that brief exchange, Tom had turned the tables, leaving Klein to reckon with his own motivations. And in that moment, something inside Klein clicked. This was no longer about getting the perfect story or making a name for himself. It was about confronting his own arrogance, his own bias. But was it too late? Would he ever be able to let go of the fight? As Tom left the room, Klein was left with a profound question echoing in his mind: who was he really trying to impress, and at what cost? The days that followed the interview were tense, not just for Tom but for Klein as well. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch, but it wasn't the kind of frenzy Klein had expected. In fact, the world had turned its attention to Tom, not because of any scandal or controversy, but because of the quiet strength he had displayed in the face of Klein's attacks. It was an irony that Klein hadn't anticipated. His plan to break the man had only made Tom more of a hero in the eyes of the public. Tom had kept a low profile after the interview, returning to his work, keeping his head down, and staying focused. He wasn't a man to seek out public validation, but he could feel the subtle shift. The world had a way of showing its appreciation in quiet, unexpected ways. Social media posts, fan messages, and news outlets were all buzzing about his calm, measured response to the aggressive questioning. People were praising his strength and humility, admiring how he had stood his ground without lowering himself to the level of his accuser. But Tom was no stranger to such waves of public sentiment. He had seen the highs and the lows of fame. What mattered to him wasn't the praise or the scorn, it was that he had stayed true to himself. Meanwhile, Klein was drowning in a sea of mixed reactions. The fallout from the interview had been swift and brutal. While some praised his courage for confronting Tom so directly, the majority of the media had turned against him. The public saw Klein as just another tabloid journalist, out for a quick story, without regard for the consequences of his actions. The headlines shifted from "David Klein Strikes Back" to "David Klein's War on Tom Cruise, a Failed Attack." Klein found himself caught between a personal and professional crisis. The reputation he had spent years building as a hard-hitting reporter was now under fire. His colleagues, once eager to support him in his quest for the big story, were now distant, reluctant to associate with his latest failed interview. The pressure was mounting, and every conversation, every glance in the hallway felt like a silent judgment. He had underestimated Tom Cruise in the worst way possible, and now, the consequences of his arrogance were becoming clear. Sitting alone in his office, Klein replayed the interview over and over in his mind. The way Tom had looked at him with quiet disdain, his words laced with truth and calmness. It wasn't the confrontation he had imagined. Instead of breaking Tom down, Klein had been the one who had been left questioning everything he thought he knew. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let his arrogance cloud his judgment to this degree? He thought of his actions as a way to challenge Tom's public persona, but he hadn't realized that by doing so, he had revealed the ugliness of his own motivations. The realization was slow but undeniable: this wasn't about truth. It was about ego. He had pursued Tom not for the sake of uncovering some hidden reality, but for the thrill of the chase, the rush of power that came with the idea of bringing a celebrity to their knees. He had been too focused on winning the battle to see the bigger picture. The real story was about integrity, humility, and the truth that didn't fit into a headline. Klein leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had come to a crossroads in his life, and he wasn't sure which path to take. His pride and his career were in tatters, and he had to figure out how to rebuild both, but more importantly, he needed to rebuild himself. It wasn't just about fixing his professional life. It was about reckoning with his actions, understanding how his need for recognition had led him down a dangerous path. Across town, Tom was in a different space, one of quiet reflection and clarity. He had received a few messages from his closest friends and colleagues, checking in to make sure he was okay. It wasn't the media coverage or the praise that made him smile, but the words of those who knew him best, who had supported him through the highs and lows of his career. Tom thought back to the interview and the way Klein had attacked him. He wasn't angry, though. It wasn't personal. He understood what Klein was trying to do. It was about making a name for himself, pushing boundaries, getting the story. Tom had been there once, at the start of his career, driven by ambition and a desire to prove something to the world. But he had learned over the years that there were more important things than being in the spotlight, more valuable things than winning an argument. What mattered most was how you carried yourself when the world was watching, and how you handled yourself when the world wasn't. Tom had spent the years building his career not just on talent but on a foundation of humility. He had always made sure to stay grounded, to remember where he came from and what truly mattered in life. In the end, it was that humility that had allowed him to rise above the noise. As he reflected on the encounter with Klein, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy. Klein's arrogance and hunger for recognition were not unlike the drive Tom had once had. But in his own journey, Tom had discovered that there was peace in letting go of the need for validation. He had built his career by living his truth, not by trying to impress anyone. And now, in the face of Klein's fall, Tom couldn't help but feel that it was his time to offer something more valuable, a lesson in humility and growth. Tom sat down at his desk, pulling out his phone and typing a quick message to Klein. "I know things didn't go the way you planned. But there's still time to make it right. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters now is what you choose to do next." He hit send, knowing it wasn't about fixing Klein's career, but offering him a chance at redemption, a chance to reflect and rebuild, just as Tom had done years ago. Tom wasn't just an actor on a screen, he was a man who understood the value of personal growth, the importance of learning from your missteps. And if he could offer that wisdom, even to someone like David Klein, then maybe the interview had served a purpose after all. Klein stared at his phone, the message from Tom sitting on the screen, words that felt like a lifeline. "There's still time to make it right." He read it again, then again. It wasn't just an invitation to fix things professionally, it was an invitation to do something bigger, to change, to learn, to be better. He had never imagined that he would receive a message like that from someone he had tried so desperately to tear down. His entire career had been about finding cracks in others, exposing their flaws, making himself seem superior in the process. But in that moment, Klein realized how empty that pursuit had been. His arrogance had only led him to ruin. And now, sitting alone in his office, he felt the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him. Tom's message wasn't about winning or losing, about pressuring Klein into some apology. It was an open door. An opportunity to acknowledge the wrongs he had committed and to take a step toward doing better. It was a message of grace. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Tom. It was an alert from the news, another headline, another story about the interview. But this time, Klein didn't feel the usual rush to click, to read, to see how the media was spinning things. He felt tired of the cycle of judgment, tired of chasing approval through the lens of controversy. The door to his office creaked open. It was his assistant, a young woman named Jenna, who had been working with him for years. She hesitated before entering, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "David, you've got a lot of calls lined up. But, there's a message from the higher-ups. They want to know if you're planning to address the interview fallout anytime soon." Klein looked at her, nodding slowly. "Tell them I'm going to take some time. I need to think about things." Jenna raised an eyebrow, sensing the change in him. "You're not going to keep digging, are you?" "No," Klein said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "I'm not going to keep digging. I'm going to stop. I've been digging my whole life, and all I've found is dirt. I think it's time I start building something instead." She smiled, a rare moment of warmth between them. "I'm glad to hear that, David." For the first time in what felt like forever, Klein felt a shift within himself. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure what his next steps would look like. But he knew one thing for sure, he was done with the game. He was done with the endless pursuit of recognition and the bitterness of chasing after stories at the cost of others. The next morning, Klein reached out to Tom, asking if they could meet. It wasn't a formal apology, he knew better than to think that a few words could erase everything. But it was a step toward understanding, a step toward growth. He wanted to hear Tom's side, to understand what had shaped him, what had given him the strength to respond with such grace. Tom agreed, and they met at a quiet cafe, far from the cameras and the press. They talked for hours, not about the interview, not about the media frenzy, but about life, ambition, mistakes, and redemption. Tom listened, never once judging Klein for his past behavior. He spoke honestly, sharing his own experiences of struggle and humility, of learning to let go of the need for constant validation. By the end of their conversation, Klein felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He realized that Tom had not just won the interview, he had won something more important. He had helped Klein find a way out of the trap he had set for himself. Klein's career wasn't fixed overnight. The media didn't forget his previous actions immediately, but something inside him had changed. He began to approach his work with a new perspective, not driven by the need to tear others down, but by a desire to tell honest, impactful stories. His arrogance had given way to a humble pursuit of truth. As the months went by, Klein's reputation slowly started to heal. He earned back the trust of some colleagues, and his work began to speak for itself. But more than that, he earned something more valuable, his own respect. Tom, on the other hand, continued to move forward, undeterred by the fleeting controversies. He remained grounded, his purpose clear, to live authentically, to continue to learn, and to inspire others through his actions. The interview had been a turning point, not just for Klein, but for both of them. As the story of their encounter faded from the headlines, Tom's words continued to resonate with Klein. What matters now is what you choose to do next. It was a question Klein would carry with him for the rest of his life, always striving to choose better, to choose growth, and to choose humility over arrogance.